And what we're going to do today is we're going to have an hour together where we're going to start off with a bit of a recap of last week's session. And then we're going to dive into today's content where we will be looking at pivot tables and how they can completely transform the way that we analyze and present our data. All right. All right, guys. So welcome to everybody. Welcome to Avi as well. We'll be co-presenting. I'll start things off and then I'll hand over at some point to Avi, who will continue presenting. Yeah, there's Avi. Welcome to you.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. Looking forward to recapping, but then going into a really awesome, powerful tool, essential tool in many ways, called a pivot table. If it has given you nightmares in the past, don't worry. We're going to give you more nightmares. No, you're not. We're going to make sure that you understand step by step what it is, how it works, and how it can help you with your data. You would have seen that I've just posted some links in the chat. I'm also going to post the actual zip folder. As always, really is important and crucial to follow along, get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves. Not on Netflix. This is hands-on, practical skills session. As always, it's being recorded, so you can and should go through the recording and recap and refresh any particular section. We'll do our best to pitch it at a pace that suits everyone. Difficult to get it exactly right, but we'll do our best to not go too fast, not go too slow. Please follow along. Please download everything from the chat, and you'll be seeing me and hearing from me again in a little.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Avi. All right, so Avi posted the links into the chat as well as the actual zipped folder, which you can download directly from the chat. It's a 6 megabyte folder, or you can click on the WeTransfer link or the Dropbox link. I've just clicked on the WeTransfer link and I've downloaded the files, and it's a downloads folder with today's date, the 25th of February, payday for some of us. All right, and you'll see I'm now in my downloads folder on Windows, and I'm going to go into it, and you'll see that there are 4 Excel files and 4 PDFs, and we've done that on purpose. And if you widen the column over here, by the way, yours might look like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. All right, how am I switching between the different views? You can do that with your mouse. All right, extra large, large, medium, small, list, details, etc., etc. Excuse me. Or you can use a keyboard shortcut, Control-Shift-1, or 2, or 3, or 4, or 5, or 6. 6 is my preference. Why? Because it actually gives you all the details. So you can see here the type of document, the size. Well, it's compressed size because we're in a compressed zipped folder. And then some additional details over here. You can see when the file was modified. So for me, this is the most organized and logical view. All right, and you can see that little arrow over there means alphabetical. Okay, so it's alphabetical order here, according to the name of the file. All right, so why do we have 4 Excel files? Because this was the start of session 1, which was 2 weeks ago on the 11th of Feb. That was the end of part 1. All right, and then this was the start of session 2, which was last week, the 18th of Feb, and that was the end of part 2. All right, so what you can see here is we have labeled things very, very clearly, which is critical. All right, so this is critical for Excel, but for any work that we're doing on Windows or on a computer, we want to be labeling things clearly so that we understand what that file is and that there's no overlap or confusion or things getting lost along the way. We want to make sure that we've got every version of the file. All right. Okay, so this end of part 1 is probably the exact same as the start of part 2. You can see the file size is almost identical there. But we're interested right now in the end of part 2 because that's where we left off at the end of last week. All right, and if we go into this file, okay, we firstly see that we've got protected view. So we've got a yellow bar up at the top, and it says, be careful because these files can contain viruses. And unless you need to edit, it's safer to stay in protected view. So we can stay in protected view. Okay, there's protected view of this file. But we know that we can trust this file. We know the source. We know that it's safe. So we can click enable editing. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to save this in a place, a location on our computer that is easy to find and that is backed up into the cloud. We mentioned this in the last two sessions. This is really important. We mentioned that we use Dropbox. You might use Google Drive or OneDrive or something else, but whatever the case is, you want to make sure that it's saved not just remotely on your locally on your computer, but also remotely into the cloud, so you can access it remotely in the future. So I'm going to press F12. It might be FN and F12. There we go. Avi, as always, has his finger on the pulse, and there's F12 for save as, or FN and F12 if your keyboard is that way inclined that you need to press the function key while you're pressing F12. Okay. And that's typically on a laptop keyboard. I'm on a full-size keyboard, so I just need to press F12. All right. So now you can see that the location over here is a strange-looking temporary folder. I don't want to be saving my work there. What I want to do is I want to save my work in the February AutoJet folder, which I've created and pinned to the quick access. It's inside my our Excel Academy marketing Dropbox folder. All right, so this will be synced with my other computer and with Avi. All right, and you'll see I've got 3 subfolders here, one for each week. So I'm going to go to this week, and as you can see, I'm quite pedantic. We're quite pedantic about this, but it makes life much easier when you've got things organized in the correct folders and subfolders, easy to locate. All right, in terms of the name of this file, I don't need the words copy of at the front. So you can see where my cursor is just at the beginning of the D. I can then press Shift Home, and that selects everything back to the beginning. I press delete, then I press N to go to the end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control Shift Left. As you can see, Control and Shift means I'm selecting and jumping word by word, which is useful. So Control Shift Left. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away all of that. I'm going to replace it with 25. So, and what I'm going to do is AutoJet session 3. Okay, so this is session 3 with today's date. It's labeled clearly. Save it there. Happy days. And now I can continue working. And then what I'm going to do every so often, quite as frequently as possible, I'm going to press Control S on my keyboard to save, so that my work gets saved. Now, interestingly, let's just pick up and maybe we can do a couple of minutes of a recap just to remind ourselves where we are, what we're doing, what this data is all about. You can see we've only got one sheet tab in our workbook. Interestingly, we didn't actually change the name of this sheet tab, and it's always a good idea to describe our names instead of using the generic default sheet 1, sheet 2, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this sheet tab. I'm going to change it to data. All right, and I can get into the habit of Control S. Okay, it's great to be in that habit that anytime you change something or do something in your work, you press Control S. All right, what you'll notice is that I've got this floating thing in the middle of my spreadsheet. What in the world is this? This is a slicer. Okay, it's called a slicer. And what is a slicer all about? A slicer is a way for us to filter our data visually. So we discussed filters last week. We looked at how we can filter our data using the traditional method, the sort and filter buttons, or what we actually did was we went, because we're working in table mode, we went to table design, that contextual tab, that tab at the top of our ribbon, and we saw that there's a slicer button, insert slicer. And what we can do if we want is we can actually create a new slicer called organization. And there we go. We've now got another slicer, and we've got a whole lot of tools and settings that we can adjust here with regard to our slicer, number of columns in our slicer. We can increase the size of the actual slicer. And this is a way for us to easily filter. Like, let's say we just want to see the people who are working at Adobe Systems. There's 4 people. If we are looking at, let's say, Turner, there's 4 people there. Ace Hardware, 6 people there. We can move this out the way so we can actually see their progress. And let's say we only want to see the 101 people at Ace Hardware. There we go. Okay, so it gives us a quick, easy visual way to filter our data. We can clear the filter there, and you can see that there's a shortcut Alt and C. So that's holding down Alt. Sorry, I think it's not working because that's defaulting to a shortcut on Zoom. Asked me if I was sure that I wanted to stop recording, and I definitely don't want to stop recording. So sometimes keyboard shortcuts on other applications actually override your shortcuts on Excel. So that can happen occasionally. And on the subject of recording, you will notice that we are recording the session just like we did last week and the week before. And that's a good fail-safe. It's a good backup for you to know that you can always refresh, rewind, rewatch, and revise. All right. So you shouldn't be left in a position where you are lost and confused and overwhelmed with all this information. If you are feeling that way, then take the time, invest the time after the session to actually revise and to rewatch. All right, you'll have the recording in your inbox tomorrow morning. All right, so what I want to do is I'm just going to use the mouse to clear the filter, but I think I remember last week we actually showed you the magic Alt key. So what is the magic Alt key? It's pressing the Alt key once when we're inside our data, and you'll see that what happens is it activates the numbers, the little hotkeys, letters and numbers on the ribbon, and you'll see that I've got the clear filter button there as my second option, my second button on my quick access toolbar. So I'm just going to press the number 2, and what that's done is it's cleared the filter. If you missed that, if you are wanting a revision of that, if you are not sure what I've done, then follow along with me here. I'm on the data tab on the ribbon, and there's the clear filter button, which at the moment is grayed out because I can't clear a filter if there's been no filter applied. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on that button regardless, and I'm going to say add to quick access toolbar. All right, so right click on a specific button on the ribbon and then say add to quick access toolbar, and it's going to put it on the quick access toolbar, which either appears here or at the top left. And then when you press Alt on your keyboard just once, then you get these numbers associated with each button on your quick access toolbar. And that's a quick, easy, convenient, efficient way to activate those buttons that you need very frequently. All right, so we've had a look at slices. Just to rewind for a moment, if we actually think back to the first session, we looked at the fact that this is a data set. It's an export from our learning management system. We jumbled up the names and surnames. As you can see here, we've got Hanan van Rienen. We also had Mohammed Shapiro, I think, in last week's session. So clearly we have randomized the first names and last names, sometimes quite comically. It's in illustrative simulation. It's an opportunity for us to work with a simulation of a data set, to manipulate the data, to clean it up, to make sense of it, and to use a whole lot of techniques in Excel to get what we want and to tell a story through our data and make better decisions through our data. So we've been on this journey using the same data set. Initially, what we did was we converted to table, which is up here on the ribbon in the insert tab. It's grayed out at the moment because it's already converted into a table. We can see the keyboard shortcut there is Control and T. All right, and that's what we did in session 1. And then we looked at the different table styles. We looked at these settings over here, these different options for banded rows and banded columns. We looked at first column and last column. We explored the total row. All right, there's the total row. We looked at how we could create an average. We could calculate an average just by simply clicking on this drop down. Remember, we used Alt and down to activate the drop down list. We saw that the average number of sign-ins for everyone on the platform is 11.77. We saw that there's 14,838 people. All right. And yeah, what we did over here is we said that we want to format these values based on the actual value. All right, so format these cells based on the actual value. And for that, what we did was we used conditional formatting. We also learned about selecting an entire column using the keyboard shortcut Control Spacebar. And Control Spacebar is where the aliens go to have a drink after a day at work at the spacebar. All right, and Control Spacebar is a great keyboard shortcut for selecting an entire column. The opposite of it is Shift Spacebar. Sometimes you might want to select an entire row. And then what we did was we went to conditional formatting and we chose a color scale. And what that did was it organized and formatted our data into green, yellow, orange, red, a whole color scale depending on the value of each one. What do I mean? If Grace Williams was actually on 0, then there we go. You can see it turns red. If she was actually on 50, it's orange. I'm going to press undo, Control Z to get back to where we were. All right, so it's a great way to do that. And then what we said was, I'll show you here, these are our WhatsApp groups with our students that we are actually tracking and supporting as they work through the content. And you can see here's a classic example. This is a group in Eswatini where they're busy with 101. In fact, they're all finished 101. That's great. And then most of them are done with 202, 83% in total. So that's an example of the average, the total row. We've applied an average calculation there at the bottom, and then 53% on 303. And then the total progress is 79%. So what have we done here? We've filtered the data so it's only this organization, and we have sorted the data from top to bottom. And there's the clue. It's sorted, it's filtered, and it's sorted from top to bottom. We've also got the number of sign-ins and the last activity. So what we can do is, let's say we want to send a report to AG Edwards. We can filter for AG Edwards over there. There we can see there are 17 people. Their aggregate progress is 91% average. And what we can then do is sort the data from largest to smallest. And there we go. We've got these, how many? We can quickly see how many people we've got if we look at this little summary over here. There are 12 people who have finished, and then there's another 5 people who are in progress. All right, and then what we could do is we can then select all of this, copy it with Control C, all right, and then paste it into wherever we want. We could paste it into WhatsApp. We could paste it into an email. We could paste it into PowerPoint or a Word document. Wherever we want to use it and paste it, we can do that. And there we go. I think we are pretty much up to speed with where we left off last week. Once again, we can clear the filters there with our mouse by clicking on the data tab and clicking the clear filter button, or by clicking over here on the quick access toolbar, or using our keyboard shortcut Alt and then the number 2. All right. All right, guys. So now we're going to take it up a level. And what we're going to do is Avi and I are going to be looking at our data, and we're going to be wondering and asking ourselves and each other the question of a number of different questions that we could ask. One of them could be, how does the progress overall on 101 compare to 202? And how does that compare to 303? And how does that compare to Outlook Secrets? Okay, so that's one question that we might be asking. And that's one particular way that we can present our data in a pivot table. Another question that we might be asking is, how does the progress compare between people who were enrolled in 2019 versus 2020 versus 21 versus 22, for example? All right, so is there a difference between people who enrolled in different years? Okay. Another thing that we might be wondering is, let's say we had country over here and we wanted to organize it and compare it and present it according to different countries. Let's say there were 5 different countries, all right, or 5 different cities or states. Okay, so essentially, we should be thinking in terms of pivot tables when we want to analyze and summarize a large, complex data set into a nice, elegant, simple dashboard. All right, so that's the role that the pivot table plays. How do I know this? Where can I get a nice definition of what a pivot table actually is? If I go to my insert tab and I hover my mouse cursor over the first button on the left-hand side, which says pivot table, it says easily arrange and summarize complex data in a pivot table. All right, then it's got an FYI. It says you can double click a value to see which detailed values make up the summarized totals. So that's great. We can do that. All right, but those first 2 lines are important. That's the definition. And the reason for us doing it is it's going to help us to easily arrange and summarize complex data into a nice pivot table. All right, so we're going to do that. All right, and we're also going to just draw your attention to the second button over here, which is recommended pivot tables. So what it says is, do you want us to recommend pivot tables that summarize your complex data? Click this button to get a customized set of pivot tables that we think will best suit your data. So this is pretty cool. It's actually Excel's built-in artificial intelligence, which is going to look, analyze, consider all the data, recognize different aspects of the data, and then give us some potential solutions for nice pivot table summaries. All right, so let's have a look at the poll that Avi has just put up on the screen. Have you ever used a pivot table before? Okay, is it yes? Is it no? Is it huh? All right, let's have a look. All right, let's see your answers to the poll. All right. Okay, 10 of you have answered so far. All right, so it looks like it's actually an even split between yes and no. Some of you have used the pivot table, some of you haven't. One person has said her. In other words, what's a pivot table? Not sure what you're asking. Okay, brilliant. Okay, Avi will leave that up. Okay, there we go. Thanks, guys. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to save our work, Control S, and we are going to actually experiment with this recommended pivot tables button. All right, it is the age of AI. Everyone's thinking AI, talking AI, implementing and integrating AI into our work. So the AI is busy thinking. You can see it's not as quick maybe as ChatGPT, but it's pretty cool because look at this. It's actually given us some recommended pivot tables. All right, so let's see. The preview was generated based on a sample of the source data and may not match the end result. Okay, and it says average of progress by course. And this was the first question that I asked, that I said Avi and I might be asking ourselves and each other, how does the progress of 101 compare to 202, compared to 303, etc. And that's what it's given us. So there's a little preview, and if I'm happy with that, I can click OK. Count of mobile number by course. All right, that doesn't seem to be making much sense. Sum of sign-in count by course. All right, so it's adding up the number of sign-ins according to the different courses. Maybe, probably not so useful. Average of progress by sign-in count. Okay, so this is the average progress of people who have signed in once or twice or three times. Maybe useful, maybe not. Okay, I think this is probably the most useful one, and this is the one that I mentioned. So we're going to go ahead with this one. We're going to click OK. And what it's done is it's built us a pivot table, and we are going to show you how you could build this yourself. But it's great to know that we can use recommended pivot tables right over there to leverage Excel's intuitive AI technology to build us something so we don't have to work too hard. Okay, so what have I done? I've zoomed in a little bit. I'm on 130% zoom. I did that by holding the control button on the keyboard and scrolling in with the mouse. Okay, so it's nice and big. And what you'll notice is that we're on a brand new sheet tab. So it's called sheet 1. I'm going to change it to pivot. All right, I'm going to save my work once again with Control S. All right, especially because I know that Avi's going to take over from me in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. So I want the spreadsheet to be synchronized with him so he can pick up immediately where we left off. And there's Avi on the screen now. So let's just have a quick look at this and just understand what we're looking at. What we can see is that the progress of Excel 101 is pretty good. It's close to 89%. 202 slightly lower. 303 is a bit lower than that. And Outlook Secrets, interestingly, is the highest of them all, 95%. All right, with the grand total being at 87.9%. Now, there was an FYI in the pivot table screen tip. It said you can double click a value to see which detailed values make up the summarized total. So what does that mean? Let's say we want to drill down and understand what's making up this 81.5. Who are these people? Progress is good, but maybe lagging slightly behind. We can double click to go in there and have a look here. This is brilliant. I think this is actually new technology or new enhancements such that it's actually called this detail one, and it's giving us a header at the top which says details for average of progress. Course is Excel 303. So that's actually fantastic because it's telling us what this is as opposed to just giving us a data dump that we haven't got a label for. So detail 1, and we've got details for average of progress. And you can see here, these are the people who have done Excel 303. So if we go to the course drop down, we only have Excel 303 people. If we press Control and down arrow, and that's one of the shortcuts that we have learned and repeatedly applied over the course of these 3 sessions, you'll see we go down to row number 1248. All right, you'll notice that the data is not formatted very well. It is wide enough. All right, but the columns are wide enough. The dates and the times are formatted nicely, but the mobile numbers are not. And the progress column is not. And we also don't have a total row. Okay, so there's some work that we could do on this. You'll notice that it's automatically put it into a table. It's automatically chosen the blue table style medium 2. If we don't like blue, we can change it. All right, but the value of this is that it's a way to drill down into the specific subset of the data. All right, what do I mean by that? It's the people who have done Excel 303. So it's that particular figure. It's the average of progress. And what we will see is that if we go and create a total row over here, and we go and we create an average of the progress, there's that value, 81.46%, which is the exact value over there, 81.5%. Okay, so that's a basic pivot table. That's drilling down into a specific value in our pivot table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save our work. And the last thing I do before I hand over to Avi is I'm going to actually rebuild this pivot table, this exact same pivot table, but I'm going to do it manually without Excel's recommended pivot tables assistance. Okay, so if I go to the insert tab, you'll see there are those two buttons. If I'm on the table design tab, you'll see that I also have that summarize with pivot table button up there. All right. And it says, again, pivot tables make it easy to arrange and summarize complicated data and drill down on the details. So what I do is I click that button. All right. You will notice that I was just standing somewhere in my data. I didn't have to go and select all the data. It's doing it for me. It's selected the table arrange, which is table 1. I can see those, we call them marching ants, the green things moving clockwise around all my data. I'm going to put my pivot table in a brand new worksheet, which is the default. I click OK, and I've got a brand new sheet tab. All right, so there's that pivot sheet, which was created when I did the recommended. Now I've got sheet 2. Can I call it pivot as well? Won't let me because the name's already taken. So I've got to do something else. So I'm going to say pivot 2. Okay, so here's my pivot 2. And here you can see this is where the pivot table will sit. These are the fields, the pivot table fields. You can see these are the actual column headings. So it's really important that our data has column headings before we put the data or convert it into a pivot table. There are my column headings. These are the 4 boxes or areas that I can drag the fields between the areas below. I can either drag them. You can see my mouse cursor becomes a pointer with the little draggy 4 arrows. Okay. Or alternatively, what I can do is I can just tick the boxes. So if I go back and look over here, the pivot table end result from those recommended pivot tables was the actual course as the row labels. All right, that's the course. And then this is the progress, the average progress. So if I go back here, what I want to do is I want to tick the box next to the word course. And that's great because what it's done is it's dragged the course filled into the rows area. All right. Once again, it's pretty small. I'm going to zoom in. And then we want progress to be in the values area. So let's tick the box that says progress, and sum of progress. Let's put it into the values area, and we're on the right track. But what in the world is it doing? It is adding up a bunch of percentages, which is not very nice at all. So what we can do is we can change that from sum to average. How do I know? Because I want the average of all these people. And you can see there, it automatically did that in the recommended pivot table. It said average of progress. So in pivot number 2, all right, what I'm going to do is I need to change this from sum to average. So you'll see there's a little drop down, which I can click on, or I just click on anywhere on that field, sum of progress, and I'm going to go to value field settings, and there I can change it from sum to average, and there we go. I could have also gotten there by double clicking on the heading where it says average of progress, and it gives you the value field settings where you can change to average. All right, and the formatting is good, and the values look perfect, and there is my pivot table. All right, the time's exactly 9:30. I'm going to save my work with Control S. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I am going to say how's it once again to Avi, and I'm going to give Avi the opportunity to take it forward from here, and I'm going to blend into the background. So Avi, over to you.
Okay, how's it? Just to remind you of a few important things. Firstly, the session is being recorded, so you're welcome to recap and rewatch any particular section. Okay, let's just get that mic at a good angle. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to open up the same file that Dan was working on. We're on Dropbox, so it's synced across both of our devices. Let me get it open, and then I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to continue where we left off. Okay, so that should be that. Okay. Now you should be seeing my screen. If you're not, let me know, but you should be seeing it. And
Yep.
a few important things to note. Firstly, in my Excel, typically my ribbon is hidden. in the sense that I'll only see the ribbon when I click on one of these tabs at the top. So you're familiar with my Excel environment. And then when I'm in Excel, I don't necessarily see all those buttons all the time. Okay, as we know, we can pin the button, we can pin the ribbon. When the ribbon is visible, if you click on this drop-down arrow over there, you can click on Always Show Ribbon. It also is a useful shortcut, Control F1 to switch it on or switch it off. So it's still there, just that I typically hide it. I don't need to see all those buttons all the time. Interestingly, there's a Chat GPT button over there. I'll have a look at that at another stage. That sounds interesting. Okay, so now where are we? Just to reorient ourselves, important for me, we've got our data. Okay, this is from when we drilled down. Then we've got pivot. This was the AI auto-generated one with suggestions. Then we've got pivot 2 because we know that we can't have two sheets with the same name. And then we've got our data. And what really is important, as Dan mentioned earlier, there's a few important prerequisites to building a pivot table. What are those? Number one, you have to have column headings. So we just had data where there was no column heading, there was no row at the top with the column headings, you wouldn't actually be able to turn it into a pivot table. Why? Because you'll see here when we see these field lists, what fields means, that's just your column headings, just a fancy word. Okay, fields, these are our column headings. So first name, last name, full name. You can see how it correlates to over here in the data, first name, last name, full name, etc. Okay. The other prerequisite is that you have continuous flowing data. If you've got lots of holes in your data, it's not going to work. It'll just take one complete set of data. What I do want to also emphasize is that you do not have to be working in table mode necessarily to convert to a pivot table. What does that mean? It means, as we know, we've discussed this throughout all of our sessions, we recommend working in table mode. It's got multiple benefits that we've discussed, but it doesn't have to be in a table, just to clarify. So even though they both got the word table in it, a table and a pivot table, we don't have to be working in table mode to get into a pivot table. So that's important. So now we're going to go back to pivot 2. And now we've got an issue. Dan, got to call RT because what happened to that thing on the right-hand side over here, all those settings went away. What should I do? Should I just close Excel and quit my job? Possibly. What we also need to do is we need to remember that we're only going to see that a pivot table fields list on the right when we're in our pivot table, meaning we're only going to see the settings when we're in the pivot table. So, for example, as well, the Analyze and the Design tab at the top of our screen, which is important, the contextual tabs that relate to working with the pivot table will only come up when we're in the context of a pivot table, meaning when we're standing in the pivot table. I'm going to quickly double check my audio settings here. I'm going to change my microphone to automatically adjust in case I'm going too loud. Okay. So that's important. When you're outside of the pivot table, you won't see the contextual tabs. And when you're outside of the pivot table, you won't see the field list. But what if, even when you click in the pivot table, you don't see the fields list? It's because you closed it like that. So in that case, even when you're in the pivot table, you won't see the pivot table fields list. So how do we get it back? We right click anywhere in our pivot table and we click on Show Field List. Okay, just to let me know that you're alive, awake, alert, and enthusiastic. Just let me know in the chat that you're following along so far, that you were able to build a basic pivot table with us so far. All we've done really is we went into our data, we clicked on Insert on the top of our screen, we inserted pivot table. We didn't have to change any settings. We just clicked on OK, and then inserted a new sheet. Dan called it pivot 2 because we already had pivot 1, and then we just clicked and dragged. So I want to continue with that. And what's really important to point out is that there's no exact right or wrong way to build a pivot table, in the sense that you need to play around, you need to be curious, you need to realize that it's flexible. In the sense, what the word pivot actually means is that we're pivoting around our data. We're looking at it from different perspectives and different angles. So we don't always know necessarily what we're gonna see and what we're gonna learn about the data. So let's just try, for example, then, if we click and drag course and we move it into the columns area, then what happens? Okay, what it's done now is it's used the course labels Excel 101, Excel 202, Excel 303, and Outlook Secrets as the column heading. So this does still work, but at this stage, it's not the easiest on the eye, in the sense that it's not the best layout, but it does still work. Got average of progress at the bottom, got our column headings over there, and then let's see then if we drag it back, that's a bit better. Okay. Let's try something else now. So let's take, for example, first name, and let's just click on it. Let's just try that. Let's just see what happens when we click. As I say, you've got to be curious. You just got to click, and you've got to see what happens. So now what it did, and let me just, you can see here, if you click in this area, you can adjust the sizing of things a little bit. You've got to find the exact right spot just to click and drag that up. So now what we can see, as we know, we've got the 4 areas in the bottom right. Those are the 4 areas that we work with when we're building the pivot table. We've got filters, which we're going to look at. We've got columns, which we just played around with a little bit. And now we've got rows area with 2 fields. As I say, the fields those are the column headings from our data. And then we've got something in the values. Most of the time, it makes sense to put something with a number into the values area. As we saw, it sometimes can default to a count. We've now changed our progress to an average. But now what did it do when we clicked on first name? Can everyone see? It just defaulted firstly to putting first name underneath the course field in the rows area. So what does that mean? As I say, it's not necessarily right or wrong, but in this case, it's maybe not so appropriate because it's too much information. If there may be some people that would want this. So for example, as we minimize all of these fields with the course headings in the row labels, we can see that on a high level, we've still got the average, but then we can click on the plus to open it up and see what is the progress per person. But let's use a keyboard shortcut. Let's jump down, control down. You can see now it's got more than 3,500 rows of data. Is it a pivot table? Yes. Is it a valid pivot table? Yes. Is it the most appropriate pivot table? Probably not, because generally speaking, the purpose of a pivot table is to simplify and to summarize. In this case, it hasn't necessarily simplified it. It hasn't summarized it so well. So maybe not the most appropriate. I'm going to jump back up by pressing Control and up. A useful thing to note as well, when you have multiple fields in the rows area, for example, what you can do as well, if you go to the Analyze tab, if you click on, you've got to be in the pivot table in terms of one of these row headings, and you'll see over here, we can click on the collapse field or expand field. These are useful buttons. I can click on, again, this will only work when you're in the pivot table. You go up to the Analyze tab on the ribbon, the contextual tab, and there's a little minus over there in the active field, and we can minimize or collapse all of the fields. But we've now agreed, hopefully, that we don't want to have first name in the rows area. So how do we get rid of it? We click and drag. We drag it out. You can see it at the top of my screen there in that top area. There's an X, and now it's removed it. Okay. Let's then look at the filters. Okay, that's the area in the top left. What might be an appropriate one in that case? Let's see if I can move this Dropbox notification. Let's maybe look at company. So we want to summarize it by company, as we have discussed a few times in terms of sending reports to groups, etc. So let's take organizations. Instead of just clicking on it, it will just put it somewhere which is maybe not where we want it. We can also untick to remove it. And you see I ticked it. It put it as a sub category underneath course in the rows area. I can untick to remove it. Just play around and see how that feels. In general, just to take a step back for a moment, with most skills, it's important and really crucial to practice. And the more you practice and the more you play around with these pivot tables, the more comfortable you'll get. Because it is possible right now, you're feeling very overwhelmed. You're like, what is this? This is rocket science. I don't know what's going on here. That's just because it's new, and that's fine. I mean, the story in terms of my history with pivot tables is that in about 2013 or something like that, I was doing a course before I'd actually even started working, and I needed to summarize a whole lot of data with trucks or something. And I've had a friend who had been working for a while, and I had a chat to him, and he said, send it to me. And I sent him the data with the trucks, and he sent it back into this pivot table. And I was like, whoa, this is way above my pay grade. I don't know what this is. And the important thing that I've learned over time is that it wasn't necessarily that what he sent me was complex, but it felt complex because it was new to me and it felt overwhelming. So with practice, with time, this will hopefully feel less overwhelming. It's really pretty straightforward when you break it down into the core components. We had our data, we inserted a pivot table, and now we're really just clicking and dragging and moving around and having fun, essentially, in many ways, with just looking at the data from different angles. So what I'm going to do then is, as I showed you, if I clicked on organization, it didn't quite go to where I wanted to go. I can untick. What I'd rather do is click and drag organization into the filters area. So now what it's done is it moved, created that filter in the top left there, in the row 1 over here. You can see it, organization. As a filter, I can click on the drop-down arrow, drop-down list, and I can filter to now see just, for example, any particular company that I want to see. So I can untick everything, and I can scroll down, or I can also search if I know what I'm looking for. So if I know from the outset that I'm looking for Owens, so I can type in Owens over there. We've got 3 different types of Owens. I can do all of them, or just the top one, Owens and Minor. I can click on OK. And now it has filtered just for that company, Owens and Minor. And now I can send this, for example, to our client. I can also, as we know, if I just want to send them Excel 202 progress Owens and Minor, again, to show you that if you double click in that particular section where it's the 91.7%, which is the average progress of Excel 202 for Owens and Minor, it will insert a new sheet, called it Detail 2. It's got that heading at the top. And now, for example, I can send this to the client to just show them how everyone is doing on Excel 202. Let's go back to Pivot 2. And what we want to now introduce is a different way to filter our data, because this is not always, if we, for example, selected 2 clients, it now just says multiple items. So it's not so clear who we're actually dealing with. So generally speaking, when it comes to filtering our pivot table, we prefer and we recommend using a slicer. We already had an introduction to a slicer over here. So we already have a little taste of what that is, but it's really useful when you're building a pivot table dashboard to understand and appreciate how to use a slicer. So let's see what that means. So now I'm going to actually remove organization. And I'm going to click in the pivot table, because again, if you're not in the pivot table, you're not going to get that contextual tab. We're going to click in the pivot table. We're going to go up to Analyze. And you'll see just to the left of center, there is a group called Filter. Got 2 different types of slicers. You've got a general slicer, which is just called a slicer, and there's a timeline. It doesn't say it there, but it's the type of slicer. So we've got a slicer, and we've got a timeline, which we're also going to get to. So let's insert slicer. As we did already earlier, we can click on organization. We can also click on course if we want. So you'll see what happens when you insert 2 slicers at once. I'm going to click on OK. And it's now just dumped them in there, not necessarily in the best position. It's selected Abbott Laboratories, I think, for some reason straight away. I'm not actually sure why, but we can see that something is filtered when it's got that little X there, which allows us to unfilter. So now we've got all of our data. And let's just look at positioning these nicely, because ultimately what's going to be a really great outcome is if we can end off with a really nice looking dashboard that's professional and presentable. At the moment, it's a little bit dreary and a bit boring and bland. We can change up some of the colors. We can also, for example, I'm going to show you how to remove the grid lines, which I typically like to do, so that, if you're in a meeting with a few colleagues, you can just really look at your pivot table dashboard, and it will make you also look really good and it'll look really professional and presentable. All I did so far is I just clicked and dragged them to nice positioning. You can also resize them if you need to, because there's some wasted space there. And now, again, we're seeing this concept come up often where if you're in a particular context, you'll have a contextual tab on the ribbon, meaning because I've now clicked on this course slicer, I've now got a contextual tab called slicer just for that slicer. So I'm going to click on that slicer. I'm going to click on the contextual tab. I'm going to go to the slicer style group, and I'm going to make it green, a little bit more exciting and a bit more lively. I'm then going to click on the other slicer. I'm going to go back to the contextual tab, and I'm going to make it yellow, again, a little bit more exciting and a little bit more colorful. I can do a similar thing with our actual pivot table. I'm going to click on the pivot table. I'm going to go up to the design tab this time. And again, we've got the styles group, and I can go and I can just find a particular style. We can get a preview like that, so we can play around and find a style that suits our needs or our personality or potentially our company identity. Okay. Other thing that I did want to show you before we haven't really gone into the slicers too much. I'll show you a few useful settings. And then again, when I'm at the point where I want to start sharing this and presenting it, I will actually close the field list on the right there. Just to remind you, if it disappears, you can right click and you can click on show field list. But once you're in a position where you want to present it and start filtering and sharing this and presenting it, you can then close that field list. So now let's just look, how do these slices work? I mean, we did already have one in our data, so it's pretty straightforward. If you click on Excel 101, it will show you Excel 101 there, and then it's just a nicer, like really interactive dashboard that we're now working towards. And then if we want to see a few companies, Abbott up until Acturna, we can do that. And again, based on the colors, we can now see what is filtered, as opposed to earlier when we had the filter in the top left, it wasn't always so easy to know what exactly was filtered. The next thing I do want to show you, as I mentioned, is when it comes to presenting, you may want to clean up the whole interface if you're creating an interactive dashboard that you want to share and present. So two things you typically could do, or a few. But the most straightforward one that I typically like to do is to remove the grid lines. So how do I do that? We don't see those little grid lines around each cell. You go up to the View tab, and you untick grid lines. Another thing you can do, but just remember how you did this so you can bring it back. If you want to remove the formula bar, because when you're in a pivot table, you don't typically need the formula bar. But when I go back to my other sheets, my formula bar is now gone. So just be very careful if you remove that one, because that's not so typical to remove that. Then you're going to wonder where it is, and you are going to need it. So if you want to bring it back, you can just tick or untick. You could even potentially remove the headings. All I'm showing you really is just how you can really declutter the space. So if you want to just focus in on your dashboard, you can do that. But just remember what you're dealing with, because you can see how, as I've mentioned, if you remove the formula bar on the View tab, it removes it from all sheets, which is not a great idea. So just be mindful of that. If you remove the column headings and the row headings, it only does that in that sheet, which is not bad because we don't really need the column and the row headings. But just be mindful of that. Find a setting that suits you. Okay. So now we've looked at some slices. I'm just going to remove all the filters over here. The next thing I want to look at is we've got 10 minutes left. I want to look at inserting a pivot chart, the useful thing. So now that we've got a nice summary of our data, we can also visualize it into a pivot chart. And I also just want to spend a few minutes looking at using dates in a pivot table. Okay, because it can be a frustrating thing. So I just want to touch on it. We do go into quite a bit more depth and detail in our Excel 202 course in terms of dealing with dates and some of the complexities that arise when you have invalid dates, for example. We're lucky that all of our dates are valid. So how do we know if our dates are valid? We go back to our data. We click on the drop-down list for last activity. If they are all automatically grouped in the filter list, you see over here, they are all automatically grouped. If you have data and you have a filter button and you click on the filter button, if they're all just listed as individual dates, you actually are dealing with invalid dates. And then in our Excel 202 course, we discuss how to actually deal with that. So I'm not going to go into that now. We've only got 9 minutes left. In our case, all of our dates are valid, so it's going to be quite a lot simpler. We go to our pivot table, which is pivot 2. We're going to right-click in the pivot table to bring back the field list. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert last activity into the columns area. So let's just see what happens. Let's just see what it does by default. So now let's zoom out a bit so we can have a bit more space. What we can do is we can move the slices to the side. So now what it's done is by default, it has grouped them really nicely. So let's just take a deep breath and have a closer look at what's going on here. It's basically grouped our dates really nicely, which I'm going to discuss. How do you group and ungroup? Because that's really important in pivot tables. Because if we just had every individual date as a column heading, it's going to be a very large pivot table. And as I mentioned, that's counter to what a pivot table should be. It should really be a nice condensed summary of your data. In this case, Excel automatically grouped them really nicely, which is great. So now we can see over the years in terms of when a person was active, as opposed to we could, for example, look at member since, which might be better because one thing that's throwing us off a little bit potentially, if you have a look there, what is going on with that 1900? Any ideas? Well, if we go to last activity, let's go and have a look. Go to last activity, we can untick everything. And if we click on 1900, what that essentially has done is anyone that hasn't actually logged in. So this data is a bit confusing. It doesn't make sense that you have progress if you haven't logged in. But we actually do have people that haven't logged in yet, and their progress would actually be on 0. And that actually is their last activity is 0. And because we formatted all of these as dates, 0 as the number corresponds to 0 January 1900. Again, beyond the scope for now. So it's a bit confusing. What we could do if we wanted to remove it from our pivot table, okay, is we'd have to go to column labels. And we'd have to untick all the 1900s. Okay. Strange that this is actually bizarre. I'm not so sure what's going on with these dates. Actually very confusing that it's put in all these strange dates over there. What I'd rather do in this case is I'd actually remove last activity. And it's now actually left all of these filters so we can manually remove them. What I'd rather do then is actually look at member since. You know, really the core thing I want to show you today in terms of time and priority is just showing you how to group and ungroup. So I'm going to put in member since. It's now moved it into the row area. What we can do, you can see it's basically put all the dates underneath the course labels. It's also grouped it really nicely, which is great. But what I actually rather do is move course into the columns area. All I did is, again, you'll get a feel for it with time and practice. You're just really moving things around. So now we've moved course into the columns area. So now we've got our row labels on the left from 2016 up till 2022. And as I mentioned, what I want to show you in the next, literally just 1 or 2 minutes, is really just looking at how do we group and ungroup our dates. So if we click on any of these dates, so now we're dealing with dates, we have to actually go to the active, on any of these active fields. We can click there, we go up to the Analyze tab, and we can click on Ungroup. Okay, so this is sometimes what you may see. I used to see this a lot in my last job. You'd insert a date, it would insert every single individual date, which as we know, is not a useful thing. It's not a great summary of the data. So what you do when you ever see this is you click on any of the dates, you go to Analyze, and you click on Group Selection. And now what we can do, we can actually choose how it groups it. Because earlier you might have noticed it did quarters and years. We may not want all of that. We may just want years. So we'll untick months, untick quarters, for example, and we'll just group it based on years. Okay, so now we're just seeing, instead of all those individual dates, we are seeing just the years. And now we can see over the years, how is the progress progressing? And Dan and I can go and analyze. But the final thing that I want to do, as I mentioned, is I want to now convert this into a pivot chart. What is a pivot chart? It's just a normal chart. You may have dealt with charts before, but it's linked to a pivot table. And why does that actually make sense? Because if we went into our regular data, I'm actually just going to remove these slices for now. If we just went here and we inserted a chart, it would not be a very good chart. Why? Because we're dealing with a massive amount of data. That actually makes a lot more sense to convert our data first into a pivot table with a nice condensed summary. and then we will convert it into a pivot chart. In the last 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm actually just going to remove this grand total, which is a useful thing to know how to do. So when you're in a pivot table, it sometimes might by default insert a total or a subtotal or grand total. So how do we change that? It's a good thing to know. We go to the design tab, we click on grand totals, and we say off. We're not going to want that at this stage. Let's leave them all off for now. And then how do we convert to a pivot chart? What is it? Do you know what a chart is? Anyone have an idea? Okay, it's a graph. It's a nice visual representation of the numbers. It's called a chart. There are different types of charts. So let's click anywhere in the pivot table. Let's go up to the Analyze tab on the ribbon, and you'll see towards the right-hand side in the Tools group, there is a button which says Pivot Chart, and the screen tip tells us, it says, insert a pivot chart tied to the data in this pivot table. So it's linked to the pivot table. We're going to click on chart. We're just going to we can go with the first one, or we can just play around and get a preview of what we think would work. Nice to look at the preview so you can actually get a sense of what it would look like. So that looks quite nice, giving us a sense over time what's actually going on. We click on OK. So what does it do by default? It will insert it into this sheet. So again, we can maybe zoom out and reposition and create a nice dashboard. Okay. So we can put it there, for example. You could, if you want, you right click. We're not going to do this now. You can right click and say move chart, and you can actually move it to its own sheet if you want. But what I really want to emphasize, and it's very important, is firstly, it really is useful sometimes to visualize the data into a chart, because it's a lot easier now to see what are the trends and patterns if we're looking at this data. So when you're just looking at the numbers here, can you notice anything just like, to the naked eye in terms of, is there a trend? Is the progress overall getting better? Is it getting worse? What's actually going on? Not necessarily. It's not so easy to just look at this and see what's going on. But I'm sure you can all agree, now that we've converted to a chart, we can really see over time, starting on the left from 2016, there's a gradual and a great increase in the progress. Okay, the percentage doesn't quite make sense because it's adding them all up. Okay, so we'd have to look at that. We can delete that potentially. We can click on it and delete it. So we can play around with that, and we can look at the specific chart elements. It's beyond the scope of today. We do go into quite a bit more detail in our Excel 202 course. But now we've really just giving you a taste and a starting point in many ways. There's so much more to do in terms of converting to a pivot table, understanding some of the mechanics of how to build it, to the 4 areas, clicking and dragging. We've looked at inserting slices and repositioning them. We've looked at how to create a really nice looking dashboard, an interactive dashboard. And the final thing I do just want to mention, first of all, I mentioned what's important is that visualizing your data is a great way to start looking and seeing trends and patterns. Other thing is, as the screen tip told us, the pivot table is linked to the pivot chart. What was the actual word that it used? It said tied. It is tied together. What does that mean? It means that if we go and click on Excel 101, what does it do? It will filter the pivot table. It will also filter the pivot chart. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it valuable. I hope you've learned a few things along the way. I'm sure you have. A massive thank you to AutoJet for providing the platform. Massive thank you to Dan, who's done most of the facilitating. And a massive thank you to you. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've got a lot of value. All these sessions have been recorded. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Final thing just really to mention, again and again and again, Excel is a very practical hands-on skill. So it's important to practice, to use it, to get your hands dirty. And with practice, and with patience, you will notice that you become more fluid, you become more confident, and we really can't emphasize that enough. So a massive thank you again, and we will see you when we see you. I think that's it. It's a 3-part series, and we'll see you soon. We can maybe post some links in the chat if you want to stay connected to us. We can connect on LinkedIn. We can put our email address if you want to get in touch with us in terms of our courses, or in terms of just getting in touch with us for some Excel questions. What we can potentially do as well, we have done in the past, is if you are interested in enrolling in our full Excel courses, we can actually offer a very generous discount to the AutoJet community, more so than what's on our website. So if we look on our website now, there is a particular discount, and I think what we can do as a gesture to the community at AutoJet, because we believe in what AutoJet stands for, and we really want to encourage everyone here to get even more upskilled, is that we can offer you an even more generous discount. Currently, we're offering 70% off. Dan, I think we can maybe look at a higher percentage, which we've done before. So we will probably not have time to do that in the chat right away, but we'll send you an email. We'll chat to Tracy and the team. And if you're interested in enrolling in our full Excel courses, we'll offer you a very exclusive discounted rate through the AutoJet community. Save 80%. Thank you, Dan. Okay. So how do you actually get that percent? We will post a link in the chat to our plans and pricing page. Thank you, Dan. You can go there. You can use the code Excel18, and you can get 80% off. You just need to have any credit card. It goes through in dollars, but don't worry about that. With 80% off, it should be hopefully within reach for you. So we look forward to seeing you on our full Excel courses if you really want to continue the journey. I think that's it from me. We'll stay in touch. Looking forward to connecting, and all the best.
Brilliant. Great stuff. Avi, well done to you. Thank you for your outstanding master facilitation for the second half of the session. We enjoyed it, and it was thorough and it was insightful. And it's not just me saying that. We've heard it in the chat. And if you haven't posted us a message in the chat before you leave, please drop us a line in the chat. Let us know what you thought of the session and the 3-part series. We are always grateful for the support and the feedback, and also open to constructive feedback. If there was anything that we could have done differently or better, please let us know. We'd love to know. Yeah, we will definitely take that into account during our future sessions, and hopefully there will be more series, more masterclass sessions with AutoJet going into the future. So a big thank you to everyone for enrolling, for showing up, and for doing your best